What if you had to draw a country? Not in a video game, but in real life. Where do you put the borders? Who gets to be a citizen? And what do you do with the people who are already living there? It sounds like an impossible job, right? Well, today we are diving into one of the most complex, controversial, and consequential stories of the 20th century. A story about an ancient dream, a modern political movement, and a tiny strip of land that three world religions call holy. This is the story of the birth of the State of Israel. And to understand it, you have to understand that for every single event in this story, there are at least two completely different and deeply passionate points of view. Let's start with a dream. For nearly 2,000 years, since the Romans destroyed their temple and scattered them across the world, many Jewish people held onto a promise, a return to Zion, their ancestral homeland. For centuries, this was mostly a religious, far-off hope. But then, the late 1800s happened, and in Europe, things got very, very ugly. In places like Russia, brutal, violent attacks against Jewish communities, called pogroms, became terrifyingly common. And a man named Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist, saw all this and had a thought. He realized that hoping for tolerance and acceptance wasn't working. He believed the only way for the Jewish people to be truly safe was to have their own country. This wasn't just a religious idea anymore. It was a modern, political movement. They called it Zionism. So the plan was simple: raise money, buy land in the ancient homeland, then part of the Ottoman Empire, and start building a nation. And thousands of idealistic Jewish pioneers, fleeing persecution in Europe, began to arrive. But there was one huge, glaring problem with this plan. The land wasn't empty. It was already home to hundreds of thousands of Arabs, Muslims, and Christians who had been living there for generations. They had their own culture, their own society, and their own dreams of one day having their own independent nation. So right from the very beginning, you have two peoples with competing national aspirations claiming the exact same piece of land. It was a pressure cooker, and someone was about to turn up the heat. That someone was Great Britain. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain was basically put in charge of the region, which they called the British Mandate for Palestine. And Britain acted like the world's worst referee. They basically blew the whistle and then gave a penalty to both teams at the same time. First, in 1917, they issued the Balfour Declaration. This was a public statement saying Britain supported the idea of creating a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Zionists were ecstatic. It was a massive victory. But Britain had also made a series of vague, confusing promises to Arab leaders who had helped them fight the Ottomans, suggesting they would support Arab independence after the war. The Arabs thought this included Palestine. So now you have two groups who both think the world's biggest superpower just promised them the same house. This is where things get messy. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Jewish immigration, especially with the rise of the Nazis in Germany, surged. The Jewish population grew. They built towns, cities, and institutions. They were building a state within a state. The Arab population watched this with growing alarm and anger. They saw their country being transformed before their very eyes, without their consent. Tensions exploded. There were riots, strikes, and brutal, violent clashes between both communities and against the British. The pressure cooker was starting to boil over. By the end of World War II, Britain was done. They were exhausted, they were broke, and they had no idea how to fix the mess they had helped create. So, they did what any global superpower does when it wants to wash its hands of a problem. They gave it to the United Nations. The UN was like a divorce lawyer brought in at the last possible second. They looked at the situation and said, "Okay, you two clearly can't live together. So, we're going to split the house." In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan. It would divide the land into two separate states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. The city of Jerusalem, holy to everyone, would be an international city controlled by neither. The Jewish leadership, while not thrilled with all the details, accepted the plan. It was their chance to finally have their own state. It was the fulfillment of Herzl's dream. The Arab leadership and the surrounding Arab nations rejected it completely. From their perspective, a foreign body was giving away more than half of their country to a population of recent immigrants. To them, it was an unacceptable injustice. The vote passed at the UN. But a vote on a piece of paper doesn't stop a war on the ground. On May 14th, 1948, the last British soldiers sailed away. And on that very same day, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish community, stood up in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. For the Jewish people, it was a moment of pure, historic triumph. After 2,000 years, they had a home. For the Palestinian Arabs and the surrounding Arab states, it was a declaration of war. The very next day, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War had begun. The story of that war is a whole video in itself. But the result changed the Middle East forever. The new, outnumbered, and poorly equipped Israeli army, fighting for its very survival, won. By the time the fighting stopped in 1949, Israel controlled even more land than the UN partition plan had given them. For Israelis, this was their war of independence. But for the Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians either fled or were expelled from their homes in the territory that became Israel. They became refugees in the surrounding countries, creating a crisis that is still at the very heart of the conflict today. In the end, the borders of 1949 weren't drawn by a UN committee with a map and a ruler. They were drawn by the sword. And that is the critical thing to understand. The birth of Israel wasn't an end to a story. It was the explosive and tragic beginning of the one we are all still living with. A story of two peoples, two narratives, and one tiny, holy, and endlessly contested piece of land.